Story 1. I don't tell this story often, not because I've forgotten it, how could I, but because even now, years later, the memory still haunts me. I don't know if anyone will believe me, but I swear on everything I hold dear, this really happened. I was living alone at the time, in a small one-bedroom apartment in a quiet neighborhood. It wasn't the best place, but it was cheap, and after a recent breakup, I just wanted a space to call my own. The building was old, built sometime in the 1950s, with creaky wooden floors and doors that never quite shut properly. But it had charm, and I liked it. For the first few months, nothing unusual happened. I worked long hours at my job and spent my nights watching TV or reading. I wasn't the social type, so I didn't have many visitors. In a way, I liked the solitude. It made me feel safe. Then, strange things started happening. It was little things at first, things I could easily explain away. I'd wake up in the morning and find my kitchen cabinet open, even though I was sure I had closed it the night before. Sometimes my keys would be in a different spot than where I left them. I chalked it up to being tired, maybe just forgetting small details. But then, things got worse. One night I woke up to the sound of scratching. It was faint at first, barely audible, but as I lay in bed holding my breath, it grew louder. It was coming from above me, the attic. I told myself it was just a raccoon or a squirrel. The building was old after all, and old buildings had pests. But the scratching didn't stop. Every night, around the same time, I'd hear it. Soft, deliberate, like someone dragging their fingernails against the wood. Then came the footsteps. It was a Sunday night, and I had just finished watching a movie. I turned off the TV and sat in silence for a moment. That's when I heard it. A slow, measured creak coming from above. I froze. My heart pounded so hard I could hear it in my ears. It wasn't an animal. It wasn't pipes settling. It was footsteps, and they were right above me. I forced myself to breathe, to think rationally. Maybe it was just the neighbor upstairs. But I didn't have a neighbor upstairs. The attic wasn't a living space. It was just an empty crawl space beneath the roof. I barely slept that night. Every sound made my skin crawl. By morning, I had convinced myself I was being paranoid, but I needed to know for sure. That evening, I grabbed a flashlight and a step stool. The attic hatch was in my hallway ceiling. My hands trembled as I reached up and unlatched it. The wooden panel swung open with a groan, releasing a gust of stale, cold air. I hesitated, then lifted myself up and shined the flashlight inside. The attic was empty, dust-covered insulation, a few abandoned boxes, cobwebs, nothing else. I let out a shaky breath, feeling silly for letting my imagination get the best of me. But just as I was about to climb down, something caught my eye. In the far corner, near the ventilation duct, there was a small pile of trash, crumpled food wrappers, an empty water bottle, and what looked like a blanket. Someone had been living in my attic. My stomach turned. My hands went numb. I scrambled down the step stool, slammed the attic hatch shut, and locked myself in my bedroom. I wanted to believe it had been left behind by a previous tenant, but deep down, I knew better. The footsteps, the scratching, someone had been up there, and they might still be. I barely slept that night, listening for any sound, any movement. Morning couldn't come fast enough. As soon as the sun rose, I called my landlord. He acted surprised but promised to send someone to check it out. That evening, a maintenance guy came by. I insisted on being there while he inspected the attic. He climbed up with a flashlight, looked around for a minute, then called down, "You said you live alone, right?" My mouth went dry. "Yeah. Why?" He climbed down, holding something in his hand. A Polaroid photo. It was a picture of me, sleeping in my bed. I don't remember much after that. I think I went into shock. The police were called, but they didn't find anyone. They said it was likely a squatter who'd been sneaking in and out while I was at work. I moved out that same week. To this day, I still don't sleep well. Every creak, every small noise in the night makes my skin crawl, because I know somewhere out there, he's still watching. Story 2. I never believed in ghosts. Not really. Sure, I enjoyed a good horror movie, but I always told myself it was just fiction. Stories meant to scare, not something that could actually happen. But after what I experienced in apartment 4C, I don't say that anymore. I don't joke about haunted places. And I definitely don't look at mirrors the same way. It started when I moved into the apartment last summer. I had just gotten out of a long-term relationship, and I needed a fresh start. The rent was cheap, the location was decent, and the landlord was eager to get someone in quickly. That should have been my first red flag, but at the time, I was just happy to have found a place I could afford. The apartment was small but cozy, 1 bedroom, a tiny kitchen, and a bathroom that had definitely seen better days. But the strangest thing about the place was the mirrors. Every room had one. A full-length mirror in the bedroom, a large one in the hallway, another above the bathroom sink, and even one in the living room, taking up almost an entire wall. I thought it was odd, but I figured maybe the previous tenant liked them. Besides, I had bigger things to worry about: unpacking, work, and getting my life back together. The first few nights were normal. I settled in, got used to the creaky floors and the occasional noises from the neighbors. But then, small things started to happen. I'd wake up and find the closet door slightly open when I was sure I had closed it. The bathroom mirror would be foggy, even though I hadn't used hot water. I told myself it was just my imagination, that I was still adjusting to the new place. But then, I saw it. It was late at night, maybe around 2 a.m. I had woken up thirsty and was heading to the kitchen for a glass of water. As I passed by the hallway mirror, something made me stop. At first I didn't know what was wrong, but then I noticed it. My reflection was a little off. It was a split second slower than me. When I raised my hand, it followed, but with a slight delay. My heart pounded. I blinked, shook my head, and chalked it up to being tired. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. Over the next few days, I started watching the mirrors more closely. The delays were subtle but consistent. It wasn't every time, but often enough to make my skin crawl. I even recorded myself to see if I was imagining it, but every time I played back the video, nothing seemed wrong. It was only when I was looking directly at them. One night I decided to test it. I stood in front of the bedroom mirror, staring at my reflection. I lifted my right arm, then my left. Everything seemed normal. Then, just as I was about to turn away, my reflection smiled. I hadn't smiled. I stumbled backward, crashing into my dresser. My breath came in short, panicked gasps. I stood there, staring at the mirror, but my reflection was normal again. Had I imagined it? Was I losing my mind? I didn't sleep that night. After that, things escalated. Shadows moved in my peripheral vision, always near the mirrors. Doors creaked open on their own. At night, I heard faint whispers coming from the living room mirror, like a conversation just below the surface of understanding. I started covering the mirrors with sheets, but every morning I'd wake up to find them uncovered. I told myself it was stress, exhaustion, anything logical. But the more I tried to explain it away, the worse it got. One night I woke up to a sound, something tapping. My eyes darted around the dark room until they landed on the mirror. My reflection was awake, but I hadn't moved. I couldn't breathe. I watched as my reflection slowly sat up in bed, tilting its head, watching me. Then it raised a hand and tapped on the glass. Tap, tap, tap. I bolted out of bed, grabbed my keys, and ran out of the apartment. I didn't stop running until I reached the lobby. The night guard gave me a strange look, but I didn't care. I spent the rest of the night in my car. The next day, I called my landlord. I told him I needed to break my lease, that something was wrong with the apartment. He sighed like he had heard it all before. "You saw it, didn't you?" My blood ran cold. "Saw what?" "The reflection," he said. "You're not the first. Every tenant sees it eventually." I demanded to know what he meant, but he just told me to leave if I wanted. No penalties, no fees. Just go. That was all I needed to hear. I packed my things that day and never looked back. I don't know what was wrong with that apartment. I don't know who or what was in those mirrors. But I do know one thing. I'll never trust my reflection again. Story 3. I still remember the way my stomach dropped the first time I heard it. The faint scratching behind the locked door. It was late at night, just past 2 a.m., and the entire apartment was silent except for the occasional creak of the old wooden floorboards. My wife, Aisha, was asleep beside me, her breathing slow and steady. But I was wide awake, frozen in place, listening to the sound that would change our lives forever. We had moved into the apartment only a week ago. It was a spacious 2-bedroom place in an old but well-maintained building in Lahore. The rent was surprisingly low for such a big space, and we had taken it without much thought. The landlord, an elderly man with tired eyes, had only one request. We were never to open the locked room at the end of the hallway. He gave no explanation, just a quiet warning before handing over the keys. At first, we didn't think much of it. The apartment was perfect, and the locked room was easy to ignore. It had no windows, no distinguishing features, just a plain wooden door with a rusted handle and an old keyhole. We assumed it was used for storage or maybe held some old furniture the landlord didn't want to move. It wasn't our concern. But that night the scratching started. It was faint at first, so soft I thought I imagined it. But as the nights passed, it became more persistent. A slow, deliberate sound, like fingernails dragging against the wood. It was always in the dead of night, when the city outside was at its quietest. Aisha dismissed it, saying it was probably mice, but I wasn't so sure. The sound was too deliberate, too steady. Curiosity got the best of me. One night I pressed my ear against the door, heart pounding. The scratching stopped immediately, as if whatever was inside knew I was listening. I held my breath, straining to hear anything else. And then, a whisper. It was faint, almost inaudible, but I was certain I heard it. A slow, breathy whisper right behind the door. I stumbled back, my skin crawling. I didn't wake Aisha. I told myself it was my imagination, that I had let paranoia get the best of me. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. Days passed, and the feeling of unease grew stronger. The apartment felt colder, the air heavier. Aisha began complaining of bad dreams, of waking up feeling like someone was watching her. The once cozy space now felt suffocating. Then, one night, the scratching turned into banging. Loud, desperate pounding shook the door, rattling the walls. Aisha bolted upright, clutching my arm. We stared at the door in horror as the sound grew more frantic, like something trapped inside was trying to escape. My instincts screamed at me to leave, to run, but I didn't. Instead, I reached for the spare keys. "Don't," Aisha whispered, her voice trembling. "The landlord warned us." I hesitated. My hand hovered over the key, but the pounding didn't stop. Something inside me needed to know, needed to see. With a deep breath, I slid the key into the lock and turned it. The door creaked open. At first, there was nothing, just darkness. The air inside was damp, carrying a stale, moldy scent. My heart pounded in my chest as I reached for the light switch on the wall. The bulb flickered to life, and we saw it. A figure crouched in the corner. Its limbs were too long, its skin stretched tight over its bones. Hollow, sunken eyes locked onto us, unblinking. And then it moved, fast. A sickening crack echoed through the room as it twisted its body, rising to its full height. Aisha screamed. I slammed the door shut, locking it as fast as I could. My hands shook violently as I grabbed Aisha and pulled her toward the front door. We ran, bare feet slapping against the cold floor, hearts hammering in our chests. We never went back. The next day, we left the keys on the landlord's doorstep and never returned to that building. I never told him what we saw. I didn't need to. He already knew. To this day, I wonder, what was inside that room? How long had it been there? And worse, was it still there, waiting for the next tenants to open the door? Story 4. They say you never really know you're being watched until it's too late. I didn't believe that. I was always the logical type, the kind who laughed at ghost stories and told people they were just imagining things. But now, after what happened in apartment 306, I don't sleep without checking the footage. I don't joke about being watched. And I never, ever ignore the feeling of eyes in the dark. I had just moved into the apartment complex a few months before it started. It was a decent place, nothing fancy but affordable. And in the city, that was all that mattered. The building was old, though, with those long, narrow hallways that always seemed too quiet, and neighbors who never made eye contact in the elevator. I figured they were just city people, busy, private, uninterested. I should have known something was wrong. It began with the noises, faint, almost imperceptible at first. A soft creak, a shuffle, the kind of sounds you chalk up to an old building settling. I ignored it. Then came the feeling, that weight on the back of your neck, like someone is standing too close behind you. But whenever I turned around, the hallway was empty, my apartment silent. I told myself it was nothing. That was my first mistake. A few weeks in, I started waking up, feeling off, like I hadn't slept at all. Some mornings, my sheets would be crumpled, twisted like I had been thrashing in my sleep. My phone would be on the floor, even though I always placed it on my nightstand. And then there was the camera. I had set up a small security camera in my living room when I moved in. Just one of those cheap ones you can check on your phone, mostly for peace of mind. I never expected to actually need it, but one night, curiosity got the better of me. I opened the app and scrolled back through the footage from the night before, and there it was. At 3:17 a.m., a figure appeared in my apartment. Not from the door, not from the window, just there, in the middle of the living room, a dark silhouette standing motionless, facing the hallway that led to my bedroom. My stomach turned to ice as I watched the figure stay there for what felt like forever. It never moved, never turned its head, just stood. And at 3:22 a.m., just as suddenly as it had appeared. It was gone. I convinced myself it was a glitch, a camera malfunction. But I knew better. My apartment had been locked. There was no way in or out. And yet, something had been there. The next night I didn't sleep. I lay in bed, phone in hand, staring at the camera feed, waiting. And at exactly 3:17 a.m., it appeared again. This time, it took a step toward the hallway, toward me. I stopped breathing. My fingers hovered over the call button. But then, just like before, at 3:22 a.m., it vanished. I couldn't do it anymore. The next morning, I called the building manager, told him someone was getting into my apartment. He sighed, like he had been expecting it, and then he told me the story. There used to be a guy in 306 years ago, he said. Kept it to himself, never left much. Then one day, we found his door open. He was gone, left everything behind. Phone, wallet, keys. Like he just walked out and never came back. I asked what happened to him. No one knows. That night I set up another camera, this time in my bedroom. If it came closer, I wanted to see. I wanted proof. I shouldn't have. At 3:17 a.m., I woke up to a sound, a faint tapping. I grabbed my phone and checked the feed. My stomach dropped. The figure was in my bedroom, standing at the foot of my bed. My breath caught in my throat. I was staring at the screen, at myself sleeping, at the thing watching me. And then, for the first time, it moved. Slowly, it tilted its head, as if it knew I was watching. Then, one step, then another, closer. My heart pounded as I scrambled for my light switch. I flicked it on and nothing. The room was empty. I checked the footage again. It was there. It had been real. But when I looked at the timestamps, something sent ice down my spine. The moment it disappeared, 3:22 a.m. That was 3 minutes after I had turned on the light. I left that apartment the next day. I didn't wait to see if it would come back. Didn't bother with my deposit. I packed a bag, walked out, and never looked back. Now, I check my cameras every night. Not because I expect to see something, but because I know one day I will.